Talk today about small multiples, and I'm not sure if everyone knows what a small multiple is, so I'm going to show a quick example of one, and then talk about how you can build small multiples in Tableau. So this is an example of a small multiple, and it's called that because you have these small charts that are repeated multiple times. In this case, it's showing one small chart per state. So this is a nice compact way of showing a lot of data that allows you to see differences across some dimension, in this case, state. So it makes sense that this should be pretty easy to do in Tableau. So I'm just going to run through a demonstration of building something like this in Tableau and some of the things that are easy, some of the pitfalls, some ways around it, etc. So this always happens to me with Google. It takes a second to get out of the slide. All right, so in a certain sense, small multiples are very easy in Tableau. So for example, if I'm just in the Superstore data set here, if I have a column with my order date year and I want to look at, say, sales, very easily, very quickly gives me a chart here, no big deal. If I want to start to slice that up by things like state in my rows and, say, product category in my columns, this is a small multiple. So it's very easy to do in Tableau when you're working with two dimensions, where one is in the rows and one is in the columns. But what if you wanted something like what I just showed, where it's a small multiple of just state, so one dimension, not two. So you could say, well, let me take out category and let me take out state and start over, and I'll drop state in my columns and hope it generates a small multiple. Well, no, it doesn't. It just gives me this big, long row of states. And, well, maybe I drop it to columns. No, it still doesn't work. So, maybe I can say, well, what if I take a copy of state and drop that in my columns? Maybe that will give me what I want, but no, it just gives me this diagonal that's not useful anyway. So, so it's become very clear that we're going to have to work a little bit harder in Tableau to get us that chart of small multiples where there's one dimension. So there are some tricks that you can do to accomplish this, different ways of calculating it. I'm going to show you one technique. At the end, I'll show you a link to, drawing a blank on his name, Makeover Monday. He's a Zen master. He's also done it in a blog article that I'll show. He uses a slightly different calculation, but just the general idea is the same. So I'm going to take out state and the copy of state and just go back to my small multiple again. What we need to do effectively here, just kind of set the stage, is we need to put each state in a row and in a column. So each state needs to be associated with a row and a column. Now we could do that just by brute force, assigning a unique number to each state, so that they just go from 1 to 50, and then same for column and so forth, and kind of break it up that way. You could do that. If you start to do any filtering though, and some states aren't showing up, then you're going to have gaps in your chart, and maybe you don't want that, or it's going to move things around the way you don't want. So what I'm going to show is a slightly different technique. First, I'm going to look at defining a custom calculation to determine which state goes into which column, and so forth and so on. It's all going to start with something that Zach actually showed as well, which is this index function. Very simple. All index does is it assigns a unique value to each mark in your visualization. So if I have 50 states, 50 marks, each one's going to get a unique index. So that's a start. But then what I want to do is I want to take that result and start to break it up to say, well, this state belongs in this row in this column. I'm going to start with columns here. And let me see if I can zoom in. Nope, hold on, let me zoom. So what I've done here is, I'm sorry, let me start with rows, not columns. So what I've done here is use something called a modulo function. Is anyone familiar with what a modulo is? It's effectively a remainder. When you're dividing two numbers, modulo is the remainder. So I've taken this index custom calculation that I showed you earlier, subtracted 1 off of it, and then did that again, and took the modulo of that against a parameter I'm defining as column count. So I've defined a parameter that lets me specify how many columns I want in this small multiple chart. That's column count. And then I'm dividing the whole thing by column count and adding 1. So like I said, I'll post this video with this calculation in it. I'll post the workbook as well. This is just Superstore data, so you can get at it if you want. So what that's now done is it's assigning each state to a different row. And you might have multiple states on the same row, which is what we want. And that's what the modulo does, is it kind of boxes. It's almost like binning for states. Next, I want to define my columns. So if I go up to my columns calculation, all I'm really doing here is I'm taking the index again, subtracting off that row that's already been defined that I just showed you, and again, multiplying by column count here. And that's what allows me to specify how many columns I'm going to have. So when I drop this in, I can drop my columns into columns. It's going to right away want to make it a measure for me. So I actually want to make it discrete because it is something discrete that I'm trying to define, or a dimension that I'm trying to define. I definitely want to drop it in front of year here. And then if I take my rows and do the same thing, again, I want to make it discrete. And I think that is, let me see, I have to consult my cheat sheet here. Oh, so I also want to, let's see, I think I want to specify this by, oh, you know what? I didn't drop in my states yet. That's what the problem is. So I want to drop in state in my level of detail and get rid of country. I'm sorry, I wanted to do subcategory here. All right, so right now it's showing me, let's see, I need to specify this as compute using subcategory, and then this one compute using subcategory. So that is kind of the final trick that you need to do to get this to break out. So now I have small multiples, 3 columns across, and as many rows down as there are subcategories. I happen to be showing this by year. If I wanted to show it by quarter, for example, I'm going to do that. And in this case, the way I've defined it, the date dimension actually needs to be a dimension as opposed to a continuous variable. There is a way around that, but for simplicity, I'm just going to keep it as a discrete measure, as discrete. And as you can see now, I have these small multiples. I can change the sizes if I want to represent each box being a different subcategory. So that's good. You know, it's starting to get there. But as you can see, some of these subcategories are much smaller in magnitude than others, and they kind of get washed out. And maybe I'm really just more interested in trend, in movement and change, and not so much magnitude from one subcategory to the next. So, so the way I can get around that is by just doing a simple table calculation. So if I say a quick table calculation of % of total, and then I want to do that by order date, you can see now it normalizes them on a scale of 0 to 1, so that I can get a better sense of what the overall trend is, as opposed to having some of them wash others out. Now this is good, but you know what is what? I mean, this is just a table of small multiples here. I don't know which, unless I hover over it, there's no way for me to tell which subcategory product this refers to. So the way that I account for that is I actually use a dual axis, and I'm going to drop this custom calculation that is just really the value 1 into my second axis, and I'm going to make it a max, or instead of a sum. As you can see, it just gives me this this straight line here. I want to specify this as a dual axis. So it puts them both on the same cell. And then the last thing I'm going to do is actually drop on that particular line my subcategory into my label. Right? So now you can see that the subcategory is showing up. And if I wanted to format that, maybe I only want to show the line ends, and I can say just show it at the end of the line. I can format this to be bigger if I want. And then maybe lastly, I just want to get that orange line off the screen. So I'll say we'll only run this from 0 to 1, which kind of moves things up a little bit. And then I still see a little orange there, so maybe I go over to colors and drop my opacity to 0. And now I can see for each one of these small multiples what the subcategory is. It's a little easier to observe. And then maybe I still want to have that sum of sales in there somewhere, so I can drop that, not there, but here, into my tooltip. And now sum of sales is there in my tooltip. I can format this, clean it up, as we all know how to do. So that is, that's how I've solved this problem with small multiples. This came up for me in my work, whereby I wasn't looking at necessarily multiple classical dimensions that I wanted to have wrapped from row to row, but instead there were metrics, a bunch of different metrics, but the metrics were stored in our data set as rows. So therefore the metrics were dimensions, or the keys of those metrics were dimensions. So I wanted these small multiples to wrap from row to row, showing all the different metrics that I was interested in looking at. So you can think about 24 metrics fit very nicely on a page now, which works really well. And again, all of this can be cleaned up. I can hide my axes here so that it simplifies the display, so forth and so on. I don't need people to know which row or column this is. Just get rid of all that, and we're good to go. So that is, and so one couple of last things. If I wanted to do further filtering on this, maybe I wanted to drop a state filter in here. I'm going to say use all, and just going to make that a quick filter. Now I can very quickly go through and see, for example, all of the different results for different states or subclasses of states, and it's always going to keep everything in the original position. The last thing I wanted to show is this ability to change the number of columns. I mentioned earlier that this is really just, this parameter is feeding into that calculation for rows and columns. So if I wanted to make this 4 columns wide, 5 columns wide, etc., I just change the parameter or take it down to 2. It's just a simple way to realign the dimensions of this view. So as I mentioned, this is Andy Krugel. That was the name I couldn't remember. He did the same thing. When I was actually putting this presentation together, I needed to look something up, and his name came up as having already done this. So he's got a great blog on it. He takes a slightly different approach to defining what the row and column is. He doesn't use modulo. He uses, I think, square roots or some other mathematical techniques. But point is, it all still works the same. So that is my presentation. As Zach mentioned, will be available for questions after. And that's about it. Thanks.